Hello and welcome back to the virtual classroom. I'm your host, Dr. Olmsted. And as you can see, the topic of today's lecture is who really won the revolution? Now, I know what you might be thinking. We talked about the revolution last time. We know who won. Treaty of Paris, 1783. We know who wins. The US, USA all the way. And so you would be remiss to feel and think that this lecture should be about what's next. What is this new radical government that we want to form? Don't worry, we'll get there. But before we do, we need to stop and talk about the reality of who is really prospering as a result that the colonies have defeated the mighty British. But before we get into this, as always, take a moment, hit pause on your video, jot down the lecture outline, which, guys, super simple today. We have three main groups we're going to talk about, and we talk about each one during the revolution and after the revolution. And then pay particular attention to those key words at the top, be able to identify the who, what, where, when, and why, be able to connect them to each other and their larger historical significance. Context, the American Revolution. Now that you've got that, let's begin. So, we already discussed this whole complicated, all the events that led to the American Revolution. We talked about the military struggle, we talked about George running through the wilderness, we talked about the British finally capitulating at Yorktown in 1781, and we will later go on to analyze how we form and frame a new government. But first, today, we need to discuss the limits of the revolution. Specifically, we need to discuss the limits of the American Revolution for those who do not fall into the category of free white men. So again, as you can see, we're going to talk about African Americans, Native Americans, and of course, women. And then kind of at the conclusion, the kind of question is like, who really won the revolution? We talk about that it was indeed a revolution, right? To change things, to create something brand new and better, and to make America great. Make the American colonies, make this new American nation great. But for whom? For what group of people? So let's start with African Americans here. Now, African Americans, the vast majority, were already enslaved in the colonies prior to the revolution. The vast majority are in the southern colonies, i.e. south of Maryland, so you're talking Virginia and further south. There were approximately, at this point in 1776, about 500,000 slaves in the colonies, again 90% in the southern colonies, Virginia having the largest population. But here's the thing. It goes without saying, but I'll say it anyway. Slavery, the enslavement of African Americans, or the enslavement in this case now African Americans, the enslavement of Africans, was vitally important and entrenched in the Southern economy. They've invested millions upon millions, in today's currency, billions of dollars. You can see on your screen, over 5.5 million pounds, English pounds, were invested in this 500,000 enslaved individuals. Now, morality aside for a second, that's a huge sum of money. So again, hear me out here. Taking morality out, we all know slavery is evil, vile, despicable, and should never have happened. But from an economic standpoint, the use of enslaved Africans represents a 5.5 million pound industry, again, today's money, over $1 billion. And by the way, this was only in Virginia. This is $1 billion, 5.5 million pounds. That was Virginia alone. And so let's just say for a moment, for argument's sake, that the revolution, some of the framers, some of these leading men took the Declaration of Independence seriously, that all men are created equal, endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, among these life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Fantastic. Let's set all the enslaved Africans free, which is what should have happened. But, again, taking morality out for a moment, how do you replace that loss in the economy? And more specifically, how do you compensate these slaveholders for their loss of economics and their loss of property? Because essentially, from their perspective, again, taking morality aside for a moment, you are taking their property, how they view African Americans, and they are, again, viewed as property. So if you strip them of that property, their way to make money, how do you compensate this financial loss and financial windfall? And so while there will be some abolitionist voices, there will be some pushes that says, oh, yeah, we do believe all men created equal, including Africans. But for the most part, this falls on deaf ears because there was such a large stake, this investment in the institution of slavery. And because of, again, their power, because of their clout, because these are essentially oligarchs who are running these large plantations, because they're not just large businessmen, not just large plantation owners with hundreds of enslaved individuals, but these are also men who are of power politically because of their connections, because of their wealth. These are oligarchs. And they will turn back any campaign that sought to eliminate what had become their primary source of wealth, power, and prestige. Think about it. These plantation owners, yes, they're making money, which means enslaved Africans are their source, are their primary source of wealth. But then a step further, it's also their power and privilege in society because they are in fact oligarchs. They are in fact have that position of power because of the money that was built on the backs of enslaved Africans. And therefore, this abolitionist critique of American society basically falls on deaf ears. And again, once the American Revolution begins, there will be again a new discussion over the abolition of slavery, the inhumanity of enslaving individuals. But again, it faced two critical issues. Number one, financial compensation. How do you compensate these former slave owners? And then number two, how do you incorporate free blacks into society? Because maybe you fall in the morality camp that says, oh, yeah, slavery is bad. You should not enslave another individual. That's bad. That's morally reprehensible. But just because you believe that does not necessarily mean you believe that black people are equal. Nor does it mean you believe that you want to compete with them for jobs, especially if you're in the North. Remember, the North is not directly dependent upon enslaved labor. Remember, 90% of the Southern colonies are the ones who hold the enslaved Africans. But just because the North doesn't have the number of enslaved individuals does not mean they're not indirectly dependent, because they're the ones who are manufacturing and producing and shipping what the South produces. And so while the Northerners are the ones who are sounding the alarm most often for abolitionist efforts, even though they don't believe it's right, there's still an economic consideration for the North, and no one's really considering the idea that we should incorporate free blacks as equals in society. Now, again, I don't want to mistake this. There were several thousand slave owners who would manumit their slaves. By the way, manumission or manumit is to release and free your enslaved individuals. But as a proportion of all slave owners, the manumissions were insignificant compared to those who would never relinquish their investment in human property. The thing is, though, the American Revolution does force a sharp collision between the ideas of human rights and property rights. Remember, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. All men created equal, endowed by their Creator. And so, this idea, this concept of the Declaration of Independence of natural rights, how does an African American, how does a black person in the colonies pursue that very goal? Now, we know how the white men of the colonies pursued it, right? We talked about that in our last lecture. They went to war to fight for life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, and they did so against the mighty British, and they eventually won. But how does life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness look? The pursuit of that. How does that look if you are a black person in the colonies in 1776? And the reality is, the war does provide opportunities for life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. It's several thousands of African Americans will have opportunities to take matters in their own hands and pursue their own life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. Because the very existence of war, first of all, provides chaos, provides distraction, and therefore an opportunity to run away. And then things get more interesting. In 1775, again, this is before the revolution even began. Now, this is after Second Continental Congress. This is after Lexington and Concord. This is after Bunker Hill. But in 1775, seeing the writing on the wall, it was still almost a year before the war actually starts officially on July 4th, 1776. But the Royal Lord Dunsmore. In 1775, Lord Dunsmore is going to issue what becomes known as Dunsmore's Proclamation. He's the Royal Governor of Virginia in 1775. And in November 1775, he will issue a dramatic proclamation that guarantees the freedom to any enslaved individual. That includes both black enslaved individuals and even indentured servants, if they could escape their masters and reach the king's forces. In other words, for most blacks in 1775, early 1776, and indentured servants, the opportunity or the pursuit of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness was far more clear if they joined the British. If they were able to escape and join the King's army, King George's army, the British army, they would get freedom. As opposed to the alternative, which is stay where you're at and maybe fight for the colonist side, which, by the way, many will. But there's no guarantee that you will have freedom at the end of the conclusion of the war. Because, yes, you may hope that these white Americans will live up to the ideas and the ideals of the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. But you have a guaranteed freedom if you join the British. You have we'll hope they live up to their promise of ideals by staying with the colonists. And quite honestly, it'd be easy to be pessimistic with the colonists because they're already there. Do you really think they're going to change their way of life? The idea of getting rid of plantations? Again, maybe, maybe not. But there's no guarantee of it. And Dunsmore's proclamation will spread quickly through the South. Thousands of enslaved Africans will flee their plantations and join the British troops. In fact, the British troops will have entire black regiments of soldiers. And wherever the British army went during the war, this proclamation was in effect. And so, on the one hand, this is an amazing opportunity for African Americans. This is a chance for freedom to pursue their own life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. On the other standpoint, though, this was a huge windfall to the British. Now, propaganda-wise, it looks great. It's demoralizing to the colonists as well. But think about the thousands of runaway enslaved individuals who came over to the British side. You got to feed them, you got to clothe them, you got to take them with you to protect them because they've left and they've run away, and now you got to live up to your end of the bargain. This is a financial drain on the British Army. Now, do we have exact numbers? No, we don't. But Thomas Jefferson, who was the Virginia wartime governor for the colonial side, he reported that in just 1781 alone, so this is just 1 year, in just one colony, Virginia, which was the largest colony in terms of population and enslaved population, he estimated and reported that 30,000 enslaved individuals fled their plantations during the British invasion of Virginia in 1781. So you're talking partial 1 year, one colony, the largest, 30,000 would flee and join the British. That's a substantial number. And thus we can say that for thousands of Black enslaved individuals, the fight for life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness was found on the British side. But what happens when the British lose? Because 1783, the Treaty of Paris, ushers in a perilous new chapter. Because there's no staying in the land of the victorious American revolutionaries. For the new United States, it was still a slave country from north to south. And for the Black man who fought for the British was a particularly hated and subject to re-enslavement. Now, for their part, the British would try to live up and help those who fled their plantations and joined the British. Yeah, I'm going to give credit where credit's due here. The British could have just said, thank you, bye-bye. Thanks for trying, you lost, oh well. They actually did try to help those who escaped to the British side. And they actually took them to, if you remember correctly, remember, the British still controlled Canada. So they took them up to a place known as Nova Scotia. It's on the eastern seaboard of Canada. It's a cold place to be. It's basically a little island area. And they actually created a settlement there for these essentially freed, enslaved Americans. And remember, this was territory acquired at the end of the 7 Years' War. And they were put there to start their own settlement. But unfortunately for these Black families, they were not welcome there either by local residents. Now, you'll see in the picture, the one on the top, well, actually both of them, are much more recent pictures, right? So there is a long legacy of families who stayed in Nova Scotia. They became known as the Nova Scotia settlers, also known as the Sierra Leone settlers. Now, after years of the white Nova Scotians not wanting to deal or live next to these, Black people, they would organize attacks on these free Black citizens. And finally, after a number of years, England would actually sponsor a fleet of ships to transport several thousand Africans back to, Africa. Again, it was voluntary. It was meant to relieve and kind of undo some of the injustice that had been done to them. You can't ever fully undo it, obviously. But this was an attempt, at least, by the British. So for several thousand, there would be some escape from the American colonists, this new country, the United States. But there would be, after the revolution in the colonies, in the new United States, there would be some renewed discussion over abolition. Remember, we need to form a new government. We need state governments. We need a federal government that we'll talk about in our next lecture. But after the Revolutionary War, a small percentage of Black Americans would gain their freedom strictly from conscience-stricken masters or those who had run away. Some slaveholders would free their slaves so they wouldn't have to support them any longer. Again, so it wasn't always altruistic. They figured these slaves were old. Let's just, hey, we're going to be nice to you and set you free. Good luck taking care of yourself now. But the biggest hope came in the north of the new United States. Several states, when drafting their state constitutions, would put in their state constitution that they will restrict or forbid slavery. For example, the state constitution of Vermont, you see it on the map in 1777, they will make slavery illegal. Other states use court orders. Massachusetts, for example. The High Court of Massachusetts would ban slavery in the courts in 1783 officially. Other states, so you see like New York, Pennsylvania, it says, you see that on your screen, it says, by state statutes enforced, aka gradual emancipation. So what is that? Well, theoretically, this is what the larger states opted for. And in theory, it sounded like a somewhat compromised idea, again, taking morality out of it. Because the idea was, it was going to be a slow process. If you just free all these enslaved individuals at once, you create a lot of problems. Number one, how do you compensate the former, slave owners? Number two is how do you incorporate these free blacks in society? So the thought was use what was called gradual emancipation or gradual abolition. This idea was, okay, so here's what we're going to do. We're going to pick an age. Now, every state, every area is a little bit different. Let's just say, for instance, on the enslaved individual's 21st birthday, they will get their freedom. So they're 15 right now. When they turn 21, they will obtain their freedom. They'll be given their emancipation and they are free. The reason this sounded like a good idea, again, morality aside, morality says you emancipate them immediately. That's just morality. That's the right thing to do. But from an economic standpoint, a social standpoint, this was seen as a compromise. You say, okay, so they're 15. In 6 years, they'll be set free. This means for the next 6 years, you can work them and recoup some of those economic losses that was part of your investment in them. And you have 6 years as a society, as a community, to figure out the best way to incorporate free blacks in your society. Again, it was designed to address those issues that we talked about at the beginning of this lecture. Downside, there were a lot of loopholes. So here's how it often worked in practice. Again, theoretically, it sounds like a maybe not terrible plan. Again, removing morality. It's slow, but it seemed like a good theoretical idea. In practice, so here's how it worked. So here's how it works. So, hey, the plantation owner comes to the enslaved individual, and says, hey, I hear it's your birthday tomorrow. I know we agreed that tomorrow you turn 21. You'll be set free. You are free and clear. You can go your own way. Congratulations. In fact, to show you my appreciation for you, here's a birthday card. So the enslaved individual opens up the birthday card, and it says, congratulations, happy birthday. Oh, by the way, you've just been sold to South Carolina. Yeah, that actually happened. So the day before, the week before, it isn't the day before, but the week before, the month before, that they are due to be set free, to gain their freedom, the slave owner sells the enslaved African someplace where slavery still exists, i.e. the South, Virginia, South Carolina, Georgia. And therefore, the state does live up to the letter of the law. They are getting rid of slavery. So yay, they're no longer a slave state, they're a free state. But they're also dealing with both those big issues we talked about at the beginning. They are selling the enslaved individual to recoup their losses financially, and they don't have to deal with the incorporation of free blacks in their society. They're selling them south, so they don't have to deal with them anymore. Yeah, it was that bad. Not only that, the enslaved individual was still enslaved individual. So the reality is, gradual abolition theoretically answered those two questions, but in practicality just created the extension of slavery, the entrenchment of slavery. So therefore, while most northern states will move to end slavery, it is not, I repeat, it is not over a concern for human life. It is not a concern to live up to those revolutionary ideals of life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, all men created equal. But rather, they are just as invested in the racial hierarchies the South is. So the reality is, by 1800, by the time we get to the new century in 1800, there are very few free blacks in the United States. In fact, as a total, only 11% of black people were free. 11%. Now, if you live in the North and you're a black person, the odds are you were free. In fact, somewhere between 99 and 100% of black people in the North were free. Because, again, look at the map. But if you are in the South and you are of African descent or Caribbean descent, there's a 95% chance you are enslaved. And therefore, by the end of the war in 1783, it is clear to the vast numbers of black Americans that much of that early revolutionary rhetoric about natural rights has been exhausted. Many reform-minded white Americans confront those two main problems. The first being economic, how will slave owners be compensated? And number two, social, how do free slaves fit into the fabric, social fabric of the new nation? And in many cases, they chose to ignore both of them because their concern was social and economic, not morality, not justice. I think it's a good place to stop right here. We'll pick up with Native Americans in the second half of this lecture. So until then, take care and bye-bye.